Let's discuss replacing the ignition lock cylinder on an early 2000s product. Now you'll see this is a lot more than just replacing the lock cylinder. It comes as a complete assembly, gets mounted onto the steering column, and includes the ignition switch. So we've got this heavy cable here carrying the electrical componentry. Now there's a couple different things we're going to have to do here. I've already gone ahead and removed the upper and lower covers so we can gain access here. But this new unit is held on by these special bolts. Now these bolts, when they're torqued properly, shear the head off. And so the difficulty is removing the old ones. There's no head to grab onto the socket. So we're going to have to drop the steering column here in a little bit. And sometimes we might have to drill these out. Sometimes we might be able to get them with a vice grips. Other times we might be able to get them with a hammer and chisel. We'll try that here in just a minute. We're also going to need to disconnect the battery. But before you disconnect the battery, make sure that you've got the unlock codes for the radio. These Hondas require a specific code to unlock the radio after it's been powered down and powered back up again. Make sure you've got that before you start this job. Also, we're going to have to transfer the mobilizer unit from the old lock cylinder to the new one. Not a big deal, just a screw, but we're going to have to do some special procedures with the keys afterwards. We're going to have to get a new key made and learn it to this vehicle, or have the old one cloned. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. One more extra tip for the day. We can see why this original lock cylinder has had some issues. Customers got quite a bit of stuff hanging from it here, and that's always detrimental to the operation of the lock cylinder itself. So with your new one, keep it as light as possible and take it easy on this. All right, let's drop this column down and try and get the old unit off. Now there's two 12mm head nuts holding up the top of the column here. There's a couple lower, but we really don't need to remove the entire column. Let's start by letting these nuts loose, and that'll allow us to tilt the top of the column down a little bit here. So let's get that out of the way. That allows us to drop the column just enough to access these bolts on the top here, where we're going to have to try and remove the original unit. Now that our column is down a little ways, let's disconnect the electrical connectors to the ignition switch itself, to the lock cylinder, to the mobilizer unit, to the shift interlock solenoid, and we're also going to disconnect the connectors for the turn signals and the wipers. Just kind of get those out of our way, free up a little bit of working space here. You might want to use your 90-degree pick or a small pocket screwdriver to help press some of these tabs in, make your job a little bit easier. Now that we've got some of the electrical connectors out of the way, we can see the bolts we're after. You can see one on this side, one on the other side. The trick is going to be to remove those. Now, quite often, the factory is going to recommend using a drill to drill those out. Well, I've had great success by using a sharp pointed pick or chisel and gently tapping on the edge of it here and begin to work it around. So essentially, we're just turning it with the punch here. And as you can see, that started to move it. Now it's loosened up. I'll be able to use the needle nose pliers or vice grips, grab a hold of that and work it the rest of the way out pretty simply. A little cleaner and less involved than actually drilling that out. Now that we've got our old unit unbolted, we have to get it unplugged yet. And so there's a couple clips along the steering column holding the harness to it. But if we follow the harness down, it plugs into the back side of the fuse box inside the vehicle here. So we've got a little 10mm headed nut we have to remove, and then also a clip on the bottom of this fuse box. That's going to allow us to gain access and unplug the unit and remove it from the vehicle. So we might have to move some of these wires here a little bit to gain access. That connector, as I said, is on the back side right there. So you may wish to actually pull this piece of trim panel off. It's not too tough. We can remove the sill plate and get some of our weather stripping off here. This piece removes rather simply. So now we can see a bunch of our connectors, but still the one we need to get at is on the back side right here. So we can probably get it with our pick and slide it out at this point. Well, now that we've got our complete old unit removed, it's time to swap out the immobilizer unit. There's just 2 screws holding this on, one on the bottom, one on the back side here, 2 Phillips head screws. I've already gone ahead and removed those. And so now the immobilizer unit has slid off our old lock cylinder. We can simply transfer it over to our new one, and the holes are there. We reuse our screws, we put it in place. We're also going to have to transfer over the supplemental wire harness here. That's for the immobilizer unit. So we'll simply cut the tie wraps and some of this tape holding it to our old harness, tie wrap it to our new harness, bolt this thing down, and we're ready for installation. Well, now that we've got our wiring mounted and routed properly, it's time to mount the lock cylinder to the steering column. Now, I've started these new bolts up here loosely, got the thing in place, and you can feel as you wiggle it around a little bit, you're going to find when you get to the right spot. Notice now once I get the right spot, and the shift interlock tab lines up, and so it should be pretty tight. Now I'm going to take an 8mm socket and tighten these bolts by hand before I finish them off by using a ratchet. Now I've got them good and snug. I'm going to take my ratchet, I'll work them back and forth here a little bit, make sure that both of them are properly snugged, and then I'm going to continue tightening until I actually break the head off of that bolt. And that's the way it's designed to be. So now we've sheared them off, we know it's torqued properly, we're ready to continue plugging in our switches now. Now that our unit is properly mounted, we've got everything plugged in, it's time to reinstall the column. So we're going to slide it up on those studs, we're going to try and work our fingers in there and get the nut started, work it on as best we can by finger before we tighten it up and properly torque that unit. Well, now we've got our whole unit buttoned up, put back together, we've got to deal with the issue of keys. Now, remember we talked earlier about the immobilizer system and how we had to transfer that module around. Well, there's information stored in the keys that gets transmitted to that module and then talks to engine control module, the ECM. And there's specific information stored in these keys, so the vehicle has to learn that information. Now, the new keys that come with your new lock cylinder are going to be blank. We're going to use those primarily to copy off of, so we know the next guy that cuts these will be able to transfer this pattern onto a new key. So we've got a couple different options. You can go up to your local parts store or hardware store or whoever copies keys for you. That's what we did here. And we had them clone the information out of our original key that we took out of the vehicle, clone that into a new key, and then we cut it to match this one. So I've got my new key. It should fit my lock cylinder. It turns, that's good. The theft information has been copied over here, and so the vehicle starts and runs. Job well done. And look at that, the radio even works as well. I've entered in the information there, and so that's a great day. One other option is if you've got an associate or you know somebody with a Honda factory scan tool, they can go in and enter in a PIN code, which is date specific. That's specific to today's date. They have to enter that information in order to learn a new key as well. But transfer the information from your original key, get it cut, like the keys that came with your lock cylinder, take your new key, and you're ready to go. Hope you've learned a lot about replacing the lock cylinder on this early 2000s Honda product. Thanks very much.